Welcome to the Prescription Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lynette Ewart, GP and personal trainer, bringing you health and strength without the hype. Thanks for listening. Eidn, thank you for your time and joining me.
Thanks for having me.
It's taken a bit of time to set this up, but we're finally ready to roll. So I like to think I know a little bit about sleep, but sleep is not the main meat in the sandwich of what I do. So that's why I wanted to talk to you, because you know this world far better than me. And there is a lot of bullshit out there when it comes to talking about sleep, whether that's fancy things that you need to buy, sprays for your pillow, glasses that you should be wearing in the evening. And I thought that people would find it really helpful to cut through some of that and talk about what really matters. Do you feel up to the job of talking about these things?
I can't wait. It's my favourite subject.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think, to kick off with, is probably the biggest bullshit myth that's circulating out there when it comes to sleep?
It's difficult to really pinpoint one, but there are two or three. And the reason why they might be the biggest bullshit is individual to different people. So if somebody latches onto one particular myth and then it starts to rule their world, then that is the biggest myth that's out there for them, whereas it might be a different myth for somebody else. But there's definitely the myth that everybody needs 8 hours of sleep is an important one. 8 hours is just an average. So when you look at thousands and thousands of people, the kind of midpoint, the average amount of sleep of that large group of people that is needed is about 8 hours. But there are plenty of people who need 9 or even 10 hours of sleep every night. And there are plenty of people who need only 7 or 6 hours of sleep every night. So it's very individual and it's set mainly by your genetics. You can't do anything about it. So it's really great that over the last few years, sleep has become a much bigger fish, if you like, in the health and wellness discussion, and that's really important. But at the same time, there are people, particularly who've read certain very popular books, who start panicking. Who start panicking because they're only getting 6 or 7 hours of sleep a night, and they've been told they need 8, otherwise they're going to get all sorts of horrible diseases and die young. And that really isn't the case. So the first one would be the myth that everybody needs 8 hours of sleep, and that's not true. The way that we describe it is it's a bit like your shoe size. Everybody has a slightly different shoe size, but there is an average. For men and women, it's different. It's actually different for men and women with sleep as well, but not as different. But there are lots of variations around that average. So people who are panicking, they sleep well for the hours that they sleep, but they're panicking because they're only getting 6 hours or 7 hours of sleep a night. That's a big and in a lot of ways harmful myth that's out there.
I fell foul of that. I read Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep when it came out in all its blazing glory. And I can honestly say I regret reading it, because it made me, I don't have a problem with sleep other than what's probably typical for my age, 47. But after reading that book, every time I had a crap night's sleep, I just thought dementia's around the corner. I've read the book now, and it really did have an adverse effect. And from what I can gather, he's had to row back because a lot of people took that message away. And now, what I would say to people is, if somebody's creating fear around sleep, what are they trying to sell you? Because they may be trying to sell you a book or a product.
Yeah,
And
and
sadly,
I think that's true for so many things, not just sleep. There's a lot of this creation of fear. If you don't take X supplement, your brain health isn't gonna be optimal and that sort of thing. I'm torn on it really on that book, because there's no question it's done a huge amount to bring sleep science, sleep medicine, and just general kind of level of discussion about sleep out into the open. It's done a huge amount in that respect. But it's not just, it certainly had a kind of fear-mongering kind of tone to it. That's definitely what a lot of people have taken away from it. But it's also littered with factual errors, with over-interpreted evidence base, with some things that just, so for example, the declaration of a global sleeplessness epidemic by the
Mm.
WHO, which features in Matthew Walker's book, doesn't exist, never happened. So there's quite a few
Mm.
that just aren't true in there. And but this is it's not just limited to that. We have a really difficult dichotomy with sleep. We have broadly, this is a massive oversimplification, but broadly we have two groups of people who we want to reach regarding their sleep. We have the won't sleeps, so that's the people who are not giving themselves enough sleep opportunities. So they're burning the candle at both ends. They're working all through the night. I'll sleep when I'm dead. Sleepers for the weak kind of brigade. The won't sleeps, I think, would do really well to read Matthew Walker's book and open their eyes to the situation a little bit. But then we have the can't sleeps, who are the people with insomnia, who are probably a much bigger group, actually. People who
Mm.
like to sleep better, but struggle with it. And unfortunately, insomnia is very much driven by anxiety and it's a form of fear. So I've heard people describe it as a form of phobia before. And for those people, reading Matthew Walker's book and learning about things that can happen if you have short sleep for a prolonged period of time has been really unhelpful, and it makes their insomnia worse. But that's the key. You mentioned that you had a bad night and you were worried that you were going to get dementia. Everyone has a bad night. Everyone a bad week or even a bad few weeks of sleep at some point or other in their lives. The harms of insufficient sleep are not through short-term insufficient sleep. They are through lack of sleep for years and really decades, to be honest.
Okay,
So
that's a really important
a
clarification, I
bad
think. Yeah.
night here or there is totally par for the course and is definitely nothing to panic about. And that's part of the problem is people who over focus on their sleep, and people with insomnia are a big group of those who tend to over focus on their sleep. People who over focus on their sleep start to overreact to one bad night or a bad week, and then they start adopting behaviors and thought patterns which actually makes the problem worse rather than better.
Mm.
So a big take home message would be, if you have a bad night, if you have a bad few nights, don't worry. Don't change anything that you do. Just carry on. Don't go to bed earlier. Don't change your routine. Just carry on and it will pass. And
I heard somebody, I can't remember her name, she's also a sleep researcher, a sleep physiologist, lady with blonde hair, glasses, that's not very helpful. But
Stephanie Romashevsky, I think.
that's it, yeah. And there was a clip of her on my feed, and the clip was, if you think you're going to get a perfect night's sleep for the rest of your life, that is completely unrealistic. And when I put that into, say, a strength training analogy, that would be like saying to somebody, if you think you can just keep adding weight to your barbell forever and never have an injury or never get sick and need to come down, that is ludicrous. And suddenly it all made sense. And I realized how ridiculous I was getting with my expectations around wanting to sleep every night. And I think some of it is just sometimes what a shitty day you're in for the next day. And it's that control freak part that makes you want to go, if I can prevent that Sunday being horrendous, then I will. But the reality is there's so many things you can control, isn't there?
That's a big part of it. In the same way as there's no such thing as perfect strength, there's also
Mm.
no such thing as perfect sleep. It just doesn't exist. But people who have perfectionist traits tend to suffer more from insomnia. It's one of the factors for suffering from insomnia. A kind of I've had very far from perfect sleep in my life for a whole host of different reasons. And one of the bits of evidence, one of the facts about sleep that really helped me when I was going through bad sleep is the stats on a bad night. So they've looked at this, looking at sleep data over a prolonged period of time in people. And if you have one bad night, the odds that the next night is going to be a good night is about 80%.
Oh, wow.
So more likely than not, you're not going to have two bad nights in a row. The next night's going to be okay. If you did have two bad nights in a row, the odds that the third night is going to be okay is 90 to 95%. These, our body and our brains are very clever at getting the sleep that we need. there isn't anything really that we can do to make that happen. All we can really do is get in the way of it by worrying too much about it, by thinking too much about it, by changing our behaviors when we
Mm.
need to. Really, sleep is an automatic process. It will sort itself out if you've had one or two bad nights. And what I really hope is that for at least some people that can take the pressure off it. It's because it's when you feel that pressure, oh, I really need to get a good night's sleep tonight because tomorrow I've got X, Y, and Z. That's when you start over focusing on it. That's when your sleep
Mm.
goes.
Actually, I heard Chris, I think it was Chris Hoy. I listened to his most recent book a few months ago. And even he made the point that before a big event, a lot of athletes tend to have very poor sleep, obviously, because they're quite
Yeah.
anxious. But it rarely seems to impact their performance in the way that they expect it will. And I thought that was really interesting, given the length that some sports teams, I know a little bit about cycling only because my husband is really into it and has talked a lot about the changes Team Sky made when they went from being crap to being brilliant.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
one of them was taking mattresses everywhere they go and trying to recreate the same environment. But I guess that feeds more into routine and predictability and those marginal gains that when you're at that level, it
Yeah.
needs to be. But for me and you, perhaps we don't need to take a mattress on holiday.
Definitely not. Although I have started taking my own pillow with me on holiday, when
Yeah.
space allows, partly but though because I've got arthritis in my neck and it
Mm.
has been very helpful. But yeah, with the thing with elite sports, and we work with elite sports teams and athletes at the Sleep Project as well, and it's all the same sort of issues, but it's magnified. So things are a little bit more under the microscope. So he's right, Chris Hoy. So there is evidence that insufficient sleep will make physical performance worse in elite athletes and their cognitive performance at whatever task they're doing as well. And probably the effects on cognitive performance are greater than on physical performance. Um, but he's right that actually, if you try not to worry about it, you will still be able to perform. It's not like you're going to suddenly turn into this kind of incoordinated weakling who can't even ride a bike. It
Mm.
will still be able to perform. The difference on performance between somebody who slept well and somebody who's got insufficient sleep is fairly small. Now, those s- small marginal gains can add up to particular situations, but the last thing that an athlete should be doing is thinking about that in the run to a competition, because the more they think about it, the more they try to sleep, the harder sleep becomes. We call that sleep effort. Sleep is not something that you can make happen. Putting
Okay.
effort into trying to fall asleep makes it for you to fall asleep.
Okay. So leaving the athletes to one side then, for your non-athletic average person who is maybe struggling to get off to sleep initiation, I think, isn't it? That's the technical term that we tend to use.
Yeah.
If that's not happening, I can imagine most people would feel I need to do something because I'm going to bed and then sleep isn't coming. So what practical steps can somebody do you think to help a bit of sleep initiation, because you're doing all the right, or let's say you're doing what you think are the right things, but what would be the kind of the better basics that people could put in place
Okay.
there?
So is the question, what can we do to help people fall asleep a bit quicker at night? Or is the question what to do if you've been lying in bed for a long time and you're not falling asleep? Because they're different.
Oh, okay. I was thinking of those as the same thing. So let's say, yeah, you've gone to bed because you felt tired, but then you lie down and suddenly tiredness seems to have vanished somewhere
Yeah.
between going
Well,
upstairs and going to bed.
should we answer both actually? Because they've answers.
Okay.
If you, I'll start with falling asleep quicker. If you want to fall asleep quicker at night time, you would think that you should be doing things around bedtime to help that happen. Probably what you do in the daytime is more important. So it all starts when you get up. And I
Okay.
think that if you're having difficulty getting off to sleep at night time, or it's taking you a long time to fall off to sleep at night, there's two changes that I would suggest to everybody
Hmm.
that will make a much, much bigger difference than anything that you could do in a routine or at bedtime or going to sleep. And the first one would be fix your wake up time every day. So
Okay.
regardless of whether you're at work, whether it's a weekend, your days off, have the same wake up time every single day. And what that helps to do is it helps to really fix your circadian rhythm. Because what
Okay.
happens, people who are not sleeping so well at nighttime, they quite often, when it comes to weekends or days off, they feel so tired that they want to have a lie in. And
Mm.
they have a lie in, and what that does is it shifts all of their circadian rhythm further back. So later in time, because they're not getting up and about early in the morning like they do when they're at work. And so when you're shifting your circadian rhythm further in time, your body's not going to want to go to sleep until later as well. It shifts everything down the line. So picking a fixed wake up time every single day, regardless of holidays, regardless of weekends, regardless of days off, is probably the single biggest factor. But what I would tie in with that is getting outside as early as you can once you've woken up, getting some natural daylight into your eyes. Um, if it's a horrible day, as it often is in the UK, then okay, getting as close as you can to having your morning coffee by a window is probably a second best. But even on a cloudy day, getting outside, you're going to get huge amounts more light than you will ever get indoors. And what that does is it helps to improve the strength of your circadian rhythm. So
Okay.
circadian rhythm has two components. It has what we call the phase, which is the timing, whereabouts in the
Hmm.
day does it make you feel alert and make you feel sleepy, but it also has a strength, it has an amplitude. And
That's interesting.
the getting out into the sun early doors will help to improve the amplitude of circadian rhythm, which for anybody who's not come across the term, all it means is body clock. We all have a
Okay.
body clock which tells us what time we want to wake up at, what time we want to go to sleep at, what time we feel hungry at. It is involved in every bodily system. And if we are trying to wake and sleep in sync with our body clock, we're going to have a much, much better time. We're going to have much more success. If we're trying to fight against our body clock, that's when we will start to have problems with not just falling asleep at nighttime, but also feeling fatigued and dreadful during the day. So, yeah, so being in sync with your body clock and having a very strong body clock, a high amplitude body clock, is going to make a much bigger difference to your nighttime sleep and how you feel during the day as well.
So, just in terms of the getting up in the morning, do you have any idea of how tightly controlled that needs to be? Because my own experience, an N of one is not a particularly scientific way of approaching this, but I find if I don't set an alarm at the weekend, I don't need an alarm most days because I'm getting up, but even 45 minutes longer than I would normally get, I notice that in the evening. And sometimes I'm glad because I'm not falling asleep at 9:30. But it would seem to me from my own experience that window for the time you get up needs to be quite strict. And you can't say it might be 7, but it might be 8. But what does the data say? Because my experience is not necessarily
So
relevant.
if you're keeping it to within half an hour or so, you're
Hmm.
safe as houses. So
Okay.
we're not here to ruin everybody's um,
Sunday morning.
enjoyment in life. Yeah. If you normally get up at 7 for work, say, and it ends up being 7:45, say, on a Sunday, there's no drama. There's no disaster there. You should try and keep it within half an hour each day. But if there's the odd day that's an hour later or whatever, it's not going to ruin everything overnight. Where there's real problems by this sort of thing is where what we call social jet lag. People who during the week they're getting up at 7 a.m. and then because they're going to work, and then maybe at weekends, maybe they're staying out later, they're not getting up till 10, 11, midday. That really screws up your body clock and is actually really bad for your health. It's called social jet lag because
Mm.
it's like jet lag. It's almost like you are twice a week flying to different time zones and your body clock is constantly playing catch up, which is actually really bad for your health. So social jet lag is a big problem. But for the people, if you sleep fine at night and you feel great during the day, that's fine. Just carry on. Whatever you're doing is
Yeah.
working for you. But if you're having difficulty sleeping at nighttime, fixing that morning wake up time is probably the single most important thing. could debate all day really about the most important thing, but it's certainly up there with the most important things you could do, the biggest difference it can make, and try to half an hour here either side is sensible.
And that's a really important point. If you are sleeping okay, those people that like to chase everything being a little bit better and this belief that it could still be a bit better and then what, you'll be a better human overall. No, you won't. If it's not a problem, don't make it into a problem. And I have to remind myself of that quite often.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you're an elite athlete, if you're a high level CEO of a massive company, then maybe working with somebody to try and just tidy up around the edges might.
Mm.
But what happens is Joe Blogs out there start who wants to perfect their sleep, starts over focusing on sleep, developing habits that actually are going to probably make things worse rather than better, and of sleep is a big driver of insomnia.
So, what about the people who we will have spoken to as patients who have been lying in bed and they've not been able to get to sleep? And I've heard all sorts of quite creative things that people have then gone on to do, from the basic, I'll come downstairs and I get a cup of tea, to I get the ironing done, or I just started work early. And people will fill that space with all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And my general advice in a GP clinic would be, okay, it's maybe best not to undertake a project in the middle of the night when it's dark and you could be tired. But what does the evidence say that people would be better to do if they've been in bed tossing and turning and they know that sleep just isn't coming?
Okay. So I'll tell you what not to do. The absolute worst thing to do is spend hours in bed tossing and turning and getting frustrated,
Mm.
because the more frustrated you get about it, the more your stress hormones start to release, the more adrenaline is flowing in your system, and the less likely you are to fall asleep. And if you do that on a regular basis, then your brain starts to get used to that. It starts to associate your bed as a place where you feel frustrated and awake rather than a place that you feel relaxed, sleepy, and drift off to
Mm.
sleep. And so this subconscious brain association also then starts to block your sleep. And this is when short-term sleeping problems turn into what we call chronic insomnia, long-term
Okay.
insomnia. So absolutely the thing not to do is to spend hours tossing and turning, lying in bed, getting frustrated that you're not asleep, and looking at the clock and constantly working out how much. Getting rid of clock faces is an important part of anyone who's having difficulty.
Okay, so don't look at the clock when you know you've been awake. Yeah,
Get
that's
rid of all
hard to
visible
do.
clock faces if you can. Now, what you should, if you find that you're not getting off to sleep, what you should do is, it varies depending really on the person. For some people, a particular technique will work better than others. But the usual advice is something that we call stimulus control. And I don't really know why it's even called that. It's a silly name for it. But it's basically this rule where if you've been in bed for more than 15 or 20 minutes, roughly, at a clock, so it just has to be roughly 15 or 20 minutes, roughly, or you're falling asleep, you're not falling asleep and you're starting to get frustrated, then what you should do is get up and out of bed. And the reason for that is so that your brain doesn't start to develop this negative association of being awake and
Mhm.
frustrated in bed. And so the idea behind stimulus control is you get up and out of bed and you go to ideally a different room if you can. If you don't have that kind of space, a different area of your bedroom. And in a dim light, you do some sort of relaxing activity. So the classic one would be um, reading, maybe knitting, maybe a jigsaw. You could watch telly if you want. It's not ideal compared to some of the others, but you do something that is relaxing light, not something that's activating, not definitely nothing work related, definitely no exercise, but something that's relaxing in a dim light until you start to feel sleepy again. So and by sleepy we mean your eyelids are starting to close, you're starting to bob a little bit, you think you're going to fall asleep. At that point, when you're feeling sleepy, and it doesn't matter how long that's been, if it's been an hour, if it's been 10 minutes, if it's been an hour, if it's been 3 hours, you wait until you feel sleepy. And at that point, when you feel sleepy, then you go back to bed. And if you fall asleep, that's great. And if you don't, you rinse and repeat. You follow rules. So give it 15, 20 minutes if you're not falling asleep or it feels like you're not going to sleep or you're starting to get frustrated, get out of bed, do the same thing and wait until you feel sleepy and go back to bed. And this is something that's particularly useful for long-standing, deep-seated sleep problems. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this the first night, but if some sleep problems have been going on for a few weeks, this is a really effective way at retraining your brain that the bed is somewhere where you should feel sleepy and drift off to sleep rather than you feel awake and frustrated. So we quite often see people who've got long-term sleep problems. They often tell us they're downstairs watching telly or watching a film or something, and they feel like they're exhausted and they feel like they're about to drift off. And they go upstairs, they think, I'm going to bed now, I feel tired, I'm going to take advantage of this. And the moment they go in the bedroom or the moment they go into bed, suddenly they're awake, they're wired. They've developed this association that when they get into bed, they feel frustrated and their brain switches on again. And so this technique is particularly effective for somebody who's had this problem for a few weeks and is getting that kind of negative association. But that's just one idea. There are a whole host of techniques that we teach when we do cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia. So some of them are relaxation techniques like mindfulness. The body scan is a kind of mindfulness type of technique. There are cognitive games, so little games that you play that keep your mind occupied. So it keeps you stopping from thinking about your sleep, stopping from getting frustrated about still being awake.
Spiraling about it all,
Exactly, but
yeah.
they're not too mentally challenging and too stimulating
Yeah.
that they then keep you awake. It's something in the middle. For as an aside, it's along the ideas of counting sheep, right? It's a sort of idea, but counting sheep doesn't work because it's just too simple and too boring. So
Yeah.
eventually people just get bored or start thinking about the sleep and tomorrow and all that sort of thing again. Whereas
Yeah.
these cognitive games that we teach during CBTI just keep you occupied a little bit better. So there's a whole host of visual imagery techniques. There's a whole host of things that somebody can do if they're lying in bed instead of tossing and turning and getting
Yeah.
frustrated.
And presumably those strategies can work quite well if you're waking at 3 or 4 a.m. because I know a lot of women my age, and I've had spells of this, you just randomly wake up at that time of the morning and suddenly what was a benign task that was on your to-do list in the middle of the day feels unbelievably important, or the answer to something appears in your brain and you think, I need to go and write that down. That's certainly what I've experienced. But not engaging with that, I know logically is the right thing, but what do you do instead to stop it from spiraling? It sounds
Yeah,
like you
it's
probably
the
answered
advice
that.
is exactly the same. So whether difficulty getting off to sleep first thing at night or waking up and not being able to go back to sleep, this advice applies. Either the 15 to 20-minute rule and getting out of bed and doing something in a quiet corner, or finding a technique, be it mindfulness, be it visual imagery, be it one of these cognitive games that keeps you occupied so you don't go into this spiral and not having any visible clock faces. I've had
Yeah.
many a discussion with clients about whether it matters or not, what time it is when you wake up. People seem to think it matters. But actually, if you know what time you need to get up at and you've set an alarm for 7 o'clock or 7:30, the fact that your alarm hasn't gone off means it's not yet 7 or 7:30. So what you should be doing is following the rules, trying to doing the activities that will help you to get back to sleep. And it shouldn't matter whether it's 1 a.m., 3 a.m., or 5 a.m. It's of no consequence because it's not time for you to get up yet. So yeah, people tend to be resistant to hiding clock faces and not having the phone by the bed, but it can be really unhelpful.
Okay. One of the many things that I found valuable from Steve Peters and the chimp paradox and his whole world of understanding the way the brain works is he explained how during the nighttime, your chimp, your survival circuit, your limbic system remains active at all times because it has to. It's that thing that hears that bump in the night. And that's often why that thing at 4 a.m. feels really important, because it's your chimp circuit that's got all the blood supply, that's in full control of your brain. And it's what's knocked out is your rational, calmer human brain, because that's sleeping and resting like it needs to be.
Yeah.
And when I had a conversation with Jess Wall from Chimp Management on the podcast, she said how a really useful thing can be just to tell the chimp to shut up. It's not now, I'll deal with it in the morning. And it's so useful. I've really found that's worked for me.
Yeah.
Not actually saying it out loud because I'd wake my husband up, but actually just in my head speaking. It's really
It's a
incredibly
really
simple and powerful.
psychological trick, that really, isn't it? Name it to tame it, they call it sometimes.
Yeah.
If you identify what it is that's going on and give it a name, that could be it could be a scientific name if you want it, or you could just call it the chimp or whatever, is a really powerful way of kind of controlling or lessening the power that thing has over you.
Yeah.
So yeah, that you hit the nail on the head there. It's an overactivity in your chimp brain, in your limbic system, because when we are asleep, and this is all hardwired into us biologically, because this is evolutionary. We really haven't evolved much in the last several thousand years. And so from an evolution point of view, when we are asleep, we're at our most vulnerable. We have to be aware of predators and things that are changing in our environment for survival reasons. So we have a massively overactive limbic system, which is very much involved in survival and threat detection. But like you said, the part of the frontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, the logical part of our brain, is massively dialed down during the night. So it doesn't matter whether you're asleep or not. So even people who are awake have much lower levels of frontal cortex functioning, and so all sorts of misperceptions happen during that part. Like you've described, it might be over worrying about things that are happening the next day, but we see it as well in patients with insomnia. By and large, they massively underestimate the amount of sleep that they've had, patients with insomnia. And a big part of that is because their frontal cortex is not accurately recording and thinks that they are awake when they are asleep. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's finding a technique that works for you is really important. Another one that we teach in our Retrain Your Sleep insomnia program is called constructive worry, and this is where you set aside some time in the evening before. So if you're somebody who's prone to worrying about things, if you're somebody who's prone to thinking about what you have to do the next day, there's really good evidence that doing this constructive worry exercise is really effective. And it's a pen and paper exercise where, ideally not just before bed, maybe a couple of hours beforehand, you write a list of all the things that are worrying you or all the things that you need to do. And in the next column, you then write down what you're going to do about it, when you're going to do it. And there's this real strange power that writing out this plan and having it written down in black and white on a piece of paper takes a lot of that cognitive load off you. Much less likely to get in the way of you falling asleep. It's much less likely for you to wake up in the night because your brain subconsciously knows that you've got a plan for all.
I think it's really important that people understand just how much of our brain activity is unconscious. It's some ridiculous figure, like about 98%. We think we're in the control seat. Most of the time, we are subject to lots of unconscious pathways that are driving us most of the time.
It's so fascinating. And this is a really exciting time for neuroscience and sleep science in particular, because Lynette, you'll remember when me and you went to medical school 25 years ago, there was none of this.
No,
Neuroscience was really basic, and it was all about how you made your muscles move. Now, really, in the last 10, 15 years, I think functional MRI scanning has been a real step change for that. But there's all sorts of new techniques. Neuroscience and sleep science is really starting to take off. We're really starting to learn so much more about it. So I think the next 5, 10, 15 years in this field is going to be even more fascinating, even more exciting.
One of the things I'd like to ask your opinion on is that in the fitness space, where I spend a lot of my time now, sleep is on the pyramid of things that has to be optimal if you want to be successful at losing weight. And a couple of my clients have asked me this week, okay, what's going on there and how true is that? And my rough estimate was that, okay, so if you're chronically underslept, that's a stress for your body to contend with.
Yeah.
And your body doesn't give up body fat easily when it's under stress because it's too closely aligned with all the other threats, such as starvation and things.
Yeah.
But actually, I don't know how exaggerated that is in the fitness space. And I wondered if you've got any views or are better educated on this, because if somebody is really struggling to sleep, how realistic is it that is the one lever that's stopping them from getting their weight loss and general health improvements going in the right direction?
Okay. I think to call it the one lever, the only thing, is definitely a massive oversimplification. Like almost everything in life, there are factors
Yeah.
affecting.
Multiple complicated factors
Yeah,
as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But there is evidence base, perhaps not how you frame the question. So optimizing your sleep in order to lose weight is probably not how I would describe it. But there
Okay.
certainly is evidence base that people who have insufficient sleep, so sleep deprivation, does impair weight loss or lead to weight gain. And there are multiple um mechanisms behind this. Hormonal. So if somebody is sleep deprived, if they're not getting enough sleep, absolutely. Like you said, this is a stress condition on the body. It puts the body under physiological stress. And this is one of the main drivers behind the long-term harms of insufficient sleep. So the risk of increased blood pressure and diabetes and heart disease further down the line is because your body is under chronic stress. It's a stress condition, physiological stress. And so as part of that, you have a lot of hormonal changes. So if you are sleep deprived, if you are underslept, insufficient sleep, then you have an excess of a hormone called ghrelin that is released that makes you feel hungrier than you would do if you were well slept. You also have the undersecretion or reduced levels of ghrelin's arch enemy leptin, a hormone that makes you feel full and satiated. Too much hormone making you feel more hungry and not enough hormone making you feel full and well satiated, which leads to people eating more inevitably because we are at the behest of our hormones to a
Mm.
large.
Look at the hangover. You have shit sleep because you've had too much to drink, and the next day you're absolutely ravenous and your hormones and hunger is all over the place,
Yeah,
which is probably the extreme end of the spectrum of that,
absolutely.
isn't it? Which we've all had.
But then the other mechanism as well, though, is that a bit like we touched on during the night, your prefrontal cortex, that very human part of your brain, the thinking part of the brain, if you are underslept, if you are sleep deprived, then your limbic system, your chimp takes over.
Hmm.
Your prefrontal cortex is really down because it needs a lot of resources to run your prefrontal cortex. And what that means in this context is that your impulse control is significantly reduced. One of the
Okay.
big things that prefrontal cortex does is stops us acting on our impulses. So different to how most mammals are, if we're in a bank queue or a shop and someone really annoys us, we don't immediately throw a fist at them. And that's our pre-cortex stepping in and saying, I know you want to hit this person, but you really shouldn't. There's reasons why that would be a really bad idea. Impulse control is one of the kind of primary functions of the prefrontal cortex. And so when it's dialed down and you're feeling hungry and you're less satiated, when you're that Snickers
You
shelf,
walk past Greg's.
or you walk past Greggs or a Chippy, it's really hard to control those impulses. So those are the kind of the main mechanisms behind it. But really the data is on sleep deprivation. I don't anything convincing that shows somebody with good sleep can lose
Yeah.
more weight by optimizing their
Yeah.
sleep. I don't think that's really realistic. Maybe for some people it can make a small difference, but there are lots of um,
Yeah.
pitfalls with trying to optimize your sleep in the first place.
Yeah.
You've just got to be really careful about that. And very interestingly, I find we used to, in the medical world, we used to think that sleep apnea, this condition that's associated with being overweight, where people stop breathing for short periods of time, but multiple times through the night, we used to think that was caused by obesity. But what we know now, that's really an old-fashioned way of thinking. What we know now is it's very much a two-way street, what we would call a bidirectional
Mm,
relation, in that people with sleep apnea tend to put on more and more weight. So it's as much the sleep apnea causing the obesity as it is the obesity causing the sleep apnea. In a way, it's a vicious cycle. And that's
mm,
because with sleep apnea, they're waking up dozens and dozens, hundreds of times through the night sometimes
mm,
to clear their airway and take a breath. And so their sleep quality is appalling. And
mm.
they are chronically underslept people. They are sleep deprived in the long term. And so that sleep deprivation leads to them eating more for all the reasons we've just discussed, and they put weight on. So it's a two-way street, really.
Yeah, and I guess it not even just sleep apnea. If you think about the amount of chronic conditions we manage in general practice, chronic pain from arthritis, back pain, this was endless, isn't there? Chronic
Yeah,
conditions. And even just polypharmacy, people being on several medications and needing to get up for a wee in the night. You can see how it becomes this pattern of chronic poor sleep, despite everybody's best
yeah,
efforts, and then leading to undersleeping, rising levels of stress, physiological stress, and that pattern then of gradual weight gain that builds up over time, and it can really become a snowball effect. And
absolutely.
yeah, interesting, the contrast between the fitness space and the real world that we live in general practice, that is far from ideal. Most people have got lots of things that they're juggling. On that, it would be worth touching upon where do sleeping pills, because we're both GPs, we will have had endless conversations with patients who have had a period of poor sleep and ring in desperation for something to help. And in my experience, I'm sure yours is probably similar. They fall into two camps: people who've going through an acute stress, maybe a bereavement or a divorce, or they've lost their job and they're just desperate to get some sleep. They tend to want sleeping pills. And I have to say, my own experiences, I'm quite sympathetic to that. But then there are people who just know that they have long spells of insomnia, and perhaps 20 years ago, their doctor gave them some medication for something and it just fixed it. It just helped them get back into a routine. And they're asking you to do that again. And I guess I struggle a bit more with that, especially when patients are on the phone and I don't know them. It's always a bit easier if they're in person and you can build a bit of relationship and understanding about what role these have. But I'd be interested to know your views, given your knowledge of sleep physiology. How do you play this when it comes up?
I think you're pretty close to the mark, really. The sleeping tablets are not the answer to long-term sleeping problems, and in many cases actually can make the problem worse. So the commonly used sleeping tablets, so things like Zopiclone, Zolpidem, Diazepam, they don't induce normal natural sleep cycles. What they are, in effect, they are sedatives. So they basically dial down all brain functions. And that's one of the reasons they're associated with lots of side effects, such as feeling really groggy the next morning, memory loss, those sorts of things. But because you don't get that kind of same typical normal sleep patterns, although people will report falling off to sleep quicker, really you can debate, are they properly asleep or are they just
Knocked
not
out.
conscious? Yeah. And so for that reason, they're not getting healthy restorative sleep. So they don't really feel better the next day. They think they've slept better. And quite often people, if they think they sleep better, do feel better. But the studies show that they don't report an improvement in how they feel during the day. And in many cases, they feel worse during the day. And then when they're taken on a regular or semi-regular basis, these sleeping tablets are addictive. They stop working, so you develop tolerance to them.
And that
And
happens quite quickly, doesn't it? I remember seeing some data that even within a couple of weeks, there can be some signs of a physiological dependence.
yeah,
Is that correct?
so again, it's so interesting. Sleep is such a unique thing. It's very personal. So it depends on the person. So it can develop within a few weeks. There are this subset of people who seem to be able to take them for weeks and months without developing any tolerance or
Okay.
dependence. So it's a very individual kind of response, but it is one of the risks, and it's not giving you normal natural sleep cycles. You're not getting restorative sleep with it, even though you think you're falling asleep quicker. So I completely agree with you that it sleeping tablets like this do have a place, but the place that they have are in very short-term use in a very significant acute crisis when someone's going through a really messy divorce, but just for they're really not getting any sleep for quite a while, and you want to just help them catch up on a little bit, or they've had the house burgled and they're frightened to death now, and they're
Hmm.
lying in bed staring at the ceiling all night. Those sorts of situations, a very short course can be helpful, and to be honest, in those situations, they're being you. It's helpful as much, if not more, in taking the edge off the anxiety that somebody is experiencing,
Yeah.
rather than giving them proper sleep. It's more dialing down that anxiety response.
Mm.
But for people who have long-term sleeping problems, they are absolutely not the answer. To call it a sticking plaster over the solution is probably overplaying the benefits of it, if they can make it worse. There used to be a time, and this is why they're still quite widely in use and prescribed widely, because there used to be a time when really that was all you could do, long-term sleeping problems. But now we have more than one really effective evidence-based treatment. We have non-medication based really effective treatments, and we have a kind of fairly new on the market medication that is evidence-based that doesn't carry the same sorts of risks that the typical sleeping tablets do. So nowadays, really, there isn't any need. There's just no need to be taking old-fashioned sleeping tablets in the long term.
What about melatonin? I've had a few people ask me, what are your views on melatonin? And I think largely because it's not been available to us to prescribe, I've had some children with special needs have it prescribed by specialists, and I've just kept the prescription going. I'll be honest, I've not waded into its role because I've not needed to, because it's not been part of
Yeah.
what we do professionally. But I'd be interested in what you think, because I know in America when I was there, I've seen it on the shelf in
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
equivalent of
There's a
boots.
few places in the world where it's just available over the counter. Not because of that, it's classed over there in the States as a food supplement rather than as
Right.
a drug. And because of that, it's really under regulated. And there was a study a few years ago looking at different off the shelf versions of melatonin in the States, and the amount of melatonin varied wildly compared to what it said on the packet. So
Okay.
anything from about half as much as it says up to 4 times as much as it says.
All right.
Um, yeah, melatonin, I guess we could divide this is a complex area which we could divide into adults and kids, because it's and insomnia versus other types of sleep disorder, because again, the evidence base is very different. So melatonin is a great drug for circadian rhythm based problems.
Right.
So circadian rhythm disorders such as what we call delayed sleep wake phase disorder. We all have circadian rhythm is just our body clock. And our body clock works either later or earlier, depending on our genetics. So we
Mhm.
have what we call late types, or we might call them night owls, is a kind of a more widely understood term for it. People whose biology wants them to go to bed later and to wake up later. By their biology, it's built into their genetics. We also have people who are early birds, or morning larks, we sometimes call them. It sounds like you might be one of those, Lynette,
Mm.
who early to bed and early to rise. And that's your biology genetics setting your body clock like that. People who have circadian rhythm disorders are people who are either extreme night owls or extreme morning larks, and that gets in the way of them functioning normally in society. So for circadian rhythm disorders, for jet lag, for people doing shift work, melatonin is a really effective and useful drug. For
Okay.
insomnia, it's pretty ineffective.
Okay.
So people
So
who
that explains the data then that shows it doesn't. I remember the prescribing senior person for our locality going, nah,
yeah,
there's no
yeah.
role for it, it doesn't work. That's the data she would have been quoting.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't go quite as far as to say that there's no role and it doesn't work. So there are meta-analyses, kind of the best kind of clinical evidence you can get, which is where they take lots and lots of different trials and then they pool all the data to make one kind of super trial. And there are meta-analyses that show that melatonin is effective in insomnia, but it increases people's sleep by somewhere in the region of 4 to 8 minutes,
Oh,
which is kind of neither here nor there, really.
okay.
It's not clinically significant.
Yeah.
However, there are certain groups of people that it is more effective for. So older people, because as you get older, your natural melatonin production starts to tail off. So that's why in the UK for insomnia, it's licensed for adults over 55, because that's really where it's
Right.
slightly better evidence base. If you're an older person with insomnia, it can be a little bit more effective. If you're a night owl type of person, so you to bed super late and wake up super late, it can be a little bit more effective for those late chronotypes. But in general, it's not a very good treatment for insomnia, and there are much better ones available and around, drug and drug free. So I wouldn't ever reach for melatonin as a first port of call for treating insomnia.
Okay. That's interesting. On
Children,
that.
it's a very different
Mm,
matter. So particularly
okay.
for children with neurodevelopmental disorders. So
Yeah.
your neurodiverse kids, autistic spectrum disorder, ADHD, it's really good evidence that melatonin is effective. However, as should be the case with any drug treatment, really, the NICE guidelines state that behavioral sleep behavioral sleep treatments should be the first line and melatonin should be a last resort. And I completely agree with that. I would agree with that as a statement across the board for almost any drug and almost any condition, really. Problem being is there are a lot of in most places in the UK, they don't have that behavioral sleep support
Yeah.
in place. And so melatonin is the default. And that's something that we're trying to change at the Sleep Project. So, who is our children and families sleep lead, does a lot of work with neurodivergent children, working on behavioral sleep techniques, which works for the vast majority of children, by the way. Most of these children do not need melatonin, but their services that are there to give them the treatment they do need just aren't available. Polly does a lot of that, and we're actually working with some NHS areas to try and get services off the ground for the NHS sleep support services off the ground. So hopefully things are going to change in future, but melatonin does seem to work, but shouldn't be the first line. It should be a last
Yeah.
resort.
Yeah. Good. Good. And it'd be good to talk to Polly on a future episode actually about that because I know lots of families who actually would benefit from just understanding because there isn't time in consultations and like you say the services just aren't put in place.
I think that's a
Um,
great idea, and I think I'd love to come on the show.
yeah.
And it's not just so time is one of the things, but also another kind of passion that we have at the Sleep Project is training healthcare professionals. Because as healthcare professionals, we've never had any of the training. I have now, obviously, but
Mm,
most GPs have never had any training on sleep disorders.
I
The
agree.
the average amount of um, coverage at medical school of sleep disorders, international study looking at this, was about an hour and a half, and that
Mm,
in a 5-year medical degree. And all of that really was focused on obstructive sleep apnea, which is a common condition, no question, but it's not as common as insomnia.
mm,
Um, and so healthcare professionals, GPs, hospital doctors, nurses, they just don't have the training on these sorts of things. So
mm.
that's something we're going to change in the coming years as well.
Yeah, I've done a bit of teaching at Leicester Uni in previous years where they are trying to introduce lots of things around this themes to the first and second years. What I would say is I think that's the wrong time. I think until you start meeting the public who are really struggling with these things, it, the students tend to feel it's a bit of fluff. They want to get to the real meaty
Yeah.
medicine things and they're not really interested in talking about sleep. And whilst we know that it's relevant because we're seeing people in our clinics, the students go,
Yeah,
give me the
and this
real.
is a cultural thing, right? This is that we really need to try and change is this cultural kind of feeling that sleep doesn't really matter. For the weak, I'll sleep when I'm dead, you snooze, you lose type of culture is something that we're really pushing against. And I think things like Matthew Walker's book has done a lot for that conversation, has done a lot to shine a light on it so we can actually start changing that conversation.
If you think about students, sleep it just comes easy when you're a student. We know from experience you can pull an all-nighter and still drag yourself in the next day when you're 22. You can't do that when you're 42,
You
and
can
I'm
doesn't
not
mean that you
52 yet.
should, though. It
No,
doesn't
I
mean
know.
you should.
But you can see why when we're trying to bring this to new students about the importance of it, and they're going, "What? They haven't reached that life stage." And that's not their fault. That is just experience
Yeah,
tells
no,
you that.
I agree,
That
I agree.
is
I think the first year is a bit early for it, really.
yeah, yeah. Okay, one last quick thing, and which I will want to ask you on is about napping. And quite coincidentally, last night when I was scrolling, this woman appeared. Don't know who she was. She'd been on Radio 4 saying,
Mm.
"Oh, the reason you feel shitty after a nap is you're doing it wrong." And I immediately rolled my eyes, thinking, like, everything's either wrong or right, and it's so polarizing. But she was making the point that if you feel shitty after a nap, you need to be napping for 90 minutes, which I'd imagine is a full sleep cycle. And I thought, hang on, that's not a nap. That's a Spanish siesta. That is not many people. Can you imagine nipping out of work? Oh, I need a nap. Otherwise, I'm not going to function this afternoon. I'll be back in an hour and a half. So, what do you think about napping? I know some people will live by it. I think there's lots of practicalities to it. If you're at work 8 till 6:30, you're probably not going to nap. But what does the science tell us about it?
I think you'll be how long have you got is the question. Um, you'll be pleased to hear here that I'm not gonna be polarizing on this. This is definitely
Yeah.
not black and white. This is as gray as it is possible to get, really. This is very mixed. Now, there is some evidence that short naps can be beneficial for cognitive sharpness, for some physiological parameters such as your blood pressure,
Okay.
but the key there is short. So
And how short is
I
short?
completely disagree with the lady that you heard on the radio. You're right, 90 minutes is approximately a sleep cycle, although there's nothing magical about 90 minutes. Any number that's quoted, there's very rare that is a definitive number. 90 minutes is a roughly an average length of someone's sleep cycle.
Mm,
Lots of people have longer sleep cycles. So how short is short? What we recommend with naps is if you are having them, is to keep them relatively early. So early afternoon is the
mm,
best time to nap if you are going to do one, because we have a natural dip in our circadian rhythm, a natural kind of little dip making us feel a bit more sleepy, which people often put down to post lunch, but actually it's a dip in the circadian rhythm. So taking advantage of that dip in your circadian rhythm and keeping it early rather than too close to bedtime will reduce the risk of it impacting on your nighttime sleep. So keeping it early and keeping it to 20, 30 minutes maximum. And the reason for that is that if you're napping for longer than that, you're more likely to fall into the deeper cycles of sleep. And waking up from deeper cycles of sleep is really unpleasant. You feel really groggy. It can make you feel really cloudy and that kind of brain fog that
mm.
we describe. And that can last well into your afternoon. That can last sometimes a couple of hours. If you are going to nap, keep it early and keep it short.
Okay.
But an absolute rule, there's a few rules really around it. An absolute rule should be that if you are having difficulty sleeping at nighttime, you must not nap during the day.
Ah,
It will make your nighttime sleep worse. So
and I've always said that to patients, and I'm really glad because I was worried you were going to go, no, that's outdated
no,
now, and I've been
no.
dishing out wrong
It's
advice.
really hard, especially people suffering with really significant insomnia who maybe they're not falling asleep until 3 or 4 AM, and then they've got to get up at 7 or 8 or whatever. It's really hard telling these people, I know you just got to plow through it. You mustn't sleep during the day. It is tough, but very often what we're seeing is that kind of habitual napping during the day to catch them on the sleep that they've not had is what is perpetuating this problem,
Mm.
what is turning it into a long-term problem because it will affect their nighttime sleep. So keeping it short, keeping it early, not napping if you are having sleep problems at nighttime. There's also some evidence that napping, how to phrase this, can be associated with some harms. So not that
Okay.
napping itself is harmful, but we do know that, or at least we don't know that, we do know that older people who nap are more likely to develop um, things like Alzheimer's disease and dementias. And we don't know exactly why this is. My personal view is that it's likely to be an association, not causation,
Yeah.
right? So people who are maybe they're napping because they sleep badly at nighttime, and it's the difficulty with them sleeping at nighttime that's driving the risk of getting dementia. Maybe there are other changes going on. Maybe they're sleeping okay at night, but there are other changes going on in the brain at an earlier stage that are making them nap during the day. So I think it's much more likely to be an association rather than napping causing that. But it's a really kind of murky grey.
Mm.
So the general advice would be, as long as you don't have sleep problems at night time, if you are napping during the day and you're keeping it short and it's working for you,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
don't go seeking naps during the day as a
To optimize your
to
sleep.
optimize your sleep. Yeah.
Yeah.
The evidence base isn't strong enough for that, and B, it might then start to lead to nighttime problems with sleep.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. So the woman's wrong. Surprise. Somebody on Instagram is wrong. You don't say. Brilliant.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like there are really good, really amazing resources out there on certainly on YouTube. I don't really use Instagram, but I'm sure some of the stuff is the same, and stuff that we never used to have access to years ago. But it's a minefield. There's a whole load of absolute nonsense out there as well, and I think that the kind of online world is starting to get to grips with it a little bit. There's a lot of talk about on Google about kind of ranking higher because of authority area. So they're starting to look at that. But yeah, it's very you got to choose who you listen to very carefully.
Yeah, yeah. And just I would say to anybody, just what might this person be trying to sell you on the back of what they're saying? Because ads and marketing is crafty and sneaky, and
Yeah.
some of it's legit, but I think if you keep that question front of mind, whether it's a magnesium spray for your pillow, and we haven't even got into supplements, but let's not go there now because I think we run the risk of talking all day. But yeah, that may be that somebody is just trying to sell you something and bending the truth
And
to
I
make
think
a sales pitch.
that's a really big one. And also, what is their background? Yeah, are they somebody who has been an Instagram influencer and is now
Yeah.
suddenly giving out advice on sleep?
Yeah.
Or is it somebody who has a clinical background, who has trained their whole life, researched their whole life,
Yeah.
and are much likely those people can be selling something and usually are, right? People are not, um, in general, people are not giving away loads and loads of their time for free for no reason. We need to make a living,
Yeah.
but yeah, always be bearing that in mind. What is it they're trying to
Yeah.
tell you?
And I think just to add to that, and it came up in my mind actually when we were talking about Matthew Walker's book, is that whilst we need researchers, we absolutely need researchers, but somebody who spends 25 years researching one topic and doesn't do clinics with a general population of unselected patients is going to have a different view. And I would argue that is our strength as GPs in that we don't get to choose who comes through the door other than the population that we serve. So it keeps you very grounded
Yeah,
in terms of how these things fit in the real world. If you only ever research sleep in sleep studies in clinics with people who've got problems, your view of what's normal becomes very skewed towards that population.
absolutely. One of the kind of, I think the kind of Achilles heel of research is that they decide whether something works or not based on the average of all the people in that trial. And actually, when you look into any trial in more detail, you'll see that there are people who are super responders who responded way more than the average to a particular medication or technique or whatever they're looking at. And you'll find that people who didn't respond at all. And we decide whether something works or not based on the average. Does the average fall above a threshold or below a threshold? Whereas in the trials, there will be plenty of people above the threshold and plenty of people below the threshold. There's
Mm.
so much inter-individual variation. And that's why I think personalized medicine is going to be the future. There's some interesting stuff in the NHS 10-year plan about that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but
Excellent.
we're a little way off that at the moment. But just because science says it doesn't necessarily work, if it works for you and you can have it, and fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So, where can people find the Sleep Project if they need help from your excellent professional services?
So our website is a slightly unusual one. It's www.thesleepproject.life. I've not
Okay.
yet come across another .life domain name in anyone else's company, but we thought it was a good fit for us. We're on Instagram. I think our do you call it handle on Instagram?
I'll link it in the show notes.
Is
Yeah.
at the underscore hash sleep underscore project. We're on LinkedIn as well. And we're unique in that we see all ages. We help people with sleep problems across the lifespan. So from babies all the way through to older people. And we help people with all different types of sleep problems. Insomnia being the most common adults, but any type of sleep problem we will help somebody with. That's our USP really is. I'm not aware of another company out there do a whole range of age ranges and all type of sleep problems. Polly does some amazing stuff. She's an absolute miracle worker, Polly. She does some real magic with babies, with children who are not sleeping, with adolescents who naturally have a
Oh,
later body clock, so want to go to bed late and sleep in. So Polly does great work with those guys who I'm sure she'll be happy to come on the program and
yeah.
explain to you.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to her. That'd be great. Brilliant. Thank you, Eidn. That's great. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for
Lots
having
that
me.
people can take away from that.